As I said in the last video, the subject of building player characters is pretty darn important. Perhaps just as important, however, and quite closely related, is how those characters develop over the course of play. Besides character development, though, I'm also going to cover some more of the stuff that players should consider while making their characters in the first place, specifically in the form of instructions on how to use the player character questionnaire, linked in the space below this video. Actually, I plan on discussing the two together, first covering a section from the questionnaire and then reviewing what it means and how it might change over the course of a game, or otherwise impact the flow of the action. If you want to pull up a copy of that questionnaire and look it over while I go through this video, please feel free. You might get more out of it if you do, and I'd like you to get as many useful ideas as possible from these videos. I mean, that's kind of the whole point. First on the character questionnaire are the questions dealing with the character's name. This is probably the single most important aspect of building a character, because once you've got your character's name, then you can start to extrapolate everything else from that point of certainty. Names, you see, are a way to firmly but subtly say, this is what my character is, right this moment. Names indicate culture, family ties, and religious affiliations. For instance, you can immediately know if somebody is from East Asia if they begin their name with their surname and have the given name afterwards, and honorifics of all sorts are important marks wherever you go. A character's use name can be a nickname, of course, which can also be a serious source of character development. Consider Peter from the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. At a critical juncture of the book, he faces his first enemy in single combat, the vicious Maugrim, leader of the White Witch's secret police. Upon defeating this deadly foe, a wolf, Peter thereafter gains the sobriquet of Wolfsbane. Similarly, when Bilbo Baggins finally takes the step that marks his transition from a fearful little hobbit to a fearsome adventurer, slaying one of the spiders of Mirkwood before it can finish him off, he gives his sword a name, Sting. And the rest is truly epic fantasy history. I mean, seriously, I get goosebumps just thinking about the first time I read that passage in The Hobbit. While my child's mind couldn't possibly process it fully, I knew that something important had just happened, and the naming of Sting was just the exclamation point that drove it home. Even more similarly, in religious settings, and also in times of political ascension, and even just upon marrying someone, people regularly take on new names, changing them to indicate to the world that they have changed in some fundamental way. And if that isn't character development, I don't know what is. So, there's just scads of stuff you'll know instantly about a character just from the name they're given, and even more to be learned by how that name changes over the course of a campaign, or the names the character gives to their stuff, which is often just as important, or possibly more. But what about more physical stuff? I refer, naturally, to the character's appearance. That's next on the questionnaire, by the way, and it's certainly got some serious potential, both for telling where a character has been and where they are right now, and very likely where they'll be in the soon-to-come. For instance, any character in a game, just like people in the real world, is almost certain to gradually become a veritable living library of scars as they progress in experience. Just think of how many you've got, from that spot where you had your appendix out, to the marks where your tonsils used to be, to the stretch marks left behind from times of feast and famine, and you start to get the idea. People accumulate scars, and everybody and anybody in the adventuring business is sure to collect quite a few. And if they're not collecting them, why not? That's a serious question, and there are many possible and quite legitimate reasons. Maybe magical healing is just that good. Maybe the character is a recent clone. Perhaps they've been placed in a powerful rejuvenation device or magic spring. Maybe an entity has stolen some of their age and the associated bodily damage, an unexpected benefit from an act that was done out of malice. Or, well, maybe the character is just a coward and really good at staying out of the way of stuff that could cause those scars in the first place. Of course, there are also the more extreme sorts of bodily harm that mark character development. I'm talking about stuff like losing eyes, ears, fingers, toes, whole limbs. This is heavy stuff, the kind of character development that's serious. This is one of those points where you, as the game master, have to stop and ask right in session 0, is character mutilation all right with you? That sort of change just doesn't stop at the physical, though. Consider, how much real change are your players' characters allowed to undergo? The random sort that's outside of their ability to control, I mean. Check with them on this one first. Also check the game rules and see if there are any special rules for this sort of stuff, or if you can house rule it. For instance, with player permission, you might drive players insane. Or you might lop off assorted body parts, as I just mentioned, or mutate them in weird and unexpected ways. There's an almost infinite amount of stuff possible, and some game systems allow a lot more of it than others. So if there's a chance for this sort of thing, you should check with your players to make sure they're okay with it first. While this might seem morbid on the front of it, and I guess it is a little, as the discussion of scars above should make clear, we mark our passage through time by the things we lose. All along the way, from the cradle to the grave, we leave behind pieces of ourselves. If an adventurer walks into a tavern, and they're sporting an eye patch to cover the weird-looking, all-seeing replacement they've got in the socket, akin to Mad Eye Moody from the Harry Potter franchise, and an arm like Edward Elric from Fullmetal Alchemist, while covering in the old marks of bites and scratches from a terrible legendary beast like Sand Tiger from the Tiger and Dale series by Jennifer Robertson. Well, now that's somebody with enough character. They don't have to introduce themselves. Anyone who meets them will immediately know who they are. Now for something completely different. I mean, slightly different. Though it's related, I promise. Something that game masters need to realize in the midst of all their plotting about the hideous harms they intend to do to their players' characters is this. It's not a challenge for a game master to kill a player's character. It's easy. If you're ever in doubt, you can always just say rocks fall, everyone dies, and bam, just like that, you've racked up a total party kill, a TPK, without breaking a sweat. No, killing your players' characters isn't the challenge to being a game master. Keeping them alive is the real challenge. And not just keeping them alive. It's quite possible to wear down your players with fight after fight, with no end in sight, and no apparent signs that any of these challenges are actually having an appreciable effect on the overarching plot. While making characters suffer from a 1,000-yard stare is character building, making your players suffer that kind of trauma, and don't you dare laugh, I've seen it happen and I've had it happen to me, is just plain criminal. The goal as a game master is to challenge your players and their characters, to push them, to stress them, but also to know when to ease off, to give them some easy threats, to let them win one, and let them think they earned it. Because honestly, if they've gotten to that point, then emotionally, yeah, they probably have. And most of all, most important of all, they need to feel like heroes. We get enough pointless crap that we have to endure in the real world, my fellow game masters. By giving our players the chance to actually make a difference in our campaign worlds, we're giving them a source of essential catharsis. And that means we're making the world a better place, one dead Dark Lord at a time. Also, bear in mind, not everybody looks good with some types of scars. Take Gimli from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. Oh, he's so awesome. Oh, John Rhys Davies, you are so awesome. And also Legolas from those films and the Hobbit series. Legolas just wasn't meant to get all scarred up. But at the same time, he seems to have been made for emotional scarring, just like the sort he endured when he lost the love of his betrothed from the Battle of Five Armies. It's not the sort of scarring that left him damaged goods, but it helped to expand on his character and explain so much about his future actions. You could take Legolas and drop him into the grimiest, grungiest steampunk game you can think of, and if the game master is doing his job right, he'll still come out without a mark on him, or even a smudge of dirt on that perfect nose of his. But he'd probably have the burden of leaving behind many friends who didn't make it. Now Gimli, on the other hand, oh yeah, he was made for scars. Seriously, stick him in an edgy steampunk game, and he'd be a full-bore Steamborg in no time flat. Oh, there's one minor note that I'd like to bring up before I move on, and that's player creativity. When the questionnaire talks about a character's home culture, you, as the game master, are, of course, the final arbiter of what does or does not fit into your campaign. That said, any living world is going to have a massive number of possible cultures, including microcultures. There's almost certainly going to be room for your players to make up their character's unique culture. Of course, and then again, I've personally only experienced such an event maybe twice, 3 times tops in all my decades of role-playing. Usually I've noticed that adventurers are noteworthy, not because of their starting culture, but because they're deliberate deviance from cultural norms in some fashion. They've been driven to their present lifestyle because they just don't fit in somehow, and so the home culture seldom, if ever, comes up in the course of play. But you can do it differently if you want, and if you do, then my advice is to give your players as much free rein as possible in designing that home and hearth from which they originally sprang. Help them out, of course, so that their design fits in with your own version of the campaign and its world, but as much as possible, try to let them play the character type for which they feel the greatest affinity. When the questionnaire asks what a character's totem is, that requires perhaps a little more explanation. This is also another subject that deals with the character's development as well. In this situation, a totem means the archetype on which the character is being built. In other words, the player selects a person, a place, or a thing or an idea, and then uses that as the underlying metaphor that informs how they make their initial character, and then how that character will advance. The most basic sort of totem is an animal of some sort. Of course, at the top of this list there's Spider-Man, a superhero based around an animal totem. As his theme song says, does whatever a spider can. This includes his character development. Originally, Peter Parker couldn't shoot webs, even though he could stick to walls, had a sense for danger, and a spider's proportionate strength. So, he made himself a set of gadget-based web shooters, and they've been a part of his ensemble ever since. Similarly, the Blue Beetle is a totem-based hero, one of my favorites personally, who started out as a magic-based super, drawing powers from an Egyptian amulet, and after he lost that, he became a gadgeteer, finally going back to the magic thing, this time as a magic-powered suit. And before you say anything, yes, I know the character's backstory is a lot more complicated than that, and there's more than one Blue Beetle, and that's why I provided a Wikipedia link below this video. But, incidentally, the Gadgeteer Blue Beetle is one of my favorites. But moving on, let's take another few simple examples of this sort of character. For instance, the Fantastic Four, one of Marvel Comics' signature superhero teams. They're also archetypes of totem-based characters, each of them drawing their powers from one of the 4 classic Greek elements: air for the Invisible Woman, earth for the Thing, fire for the Human Torch, and water for Mr. Fantastic. Of course, the same can be said for the cast of Mike Mignola's BPRD after Hellboy left the team, with Abe Sapien as the element of water, Liz Sherman as fire, Roger the Homunculus as earth, and Johann Kraus as the element of air. And, well, yeah, the same deal with Captain Planet and the Planeteers. Personally, I think that show could have been really awesome if Captain Planet had been left out, and the Planeteers had to solve problems without access to their blue-skinned Deus Ex Machina. Seriously, take Captain Planet out of the picture, and you've got the awesome basis for a campaign right there. I would be remiss, while talking about elements, to not also mention the elements of harmony. You know, the character traits that make up the main six of Lauren Faust's My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. The series is pretty much all about character development, and for that reason alone, I recommend it to game masters and players alike. That, and considering all the lessons that the show teaches about basic communication skills, another essential ingredient to good role-playing, especially good game mastering, and you'd be well served in giving the series a watch. And I also think it's a pretty darn nifty show in its own right. No, I'm not a brony. I just watched the show for the articles. Anyway, once you open up the idea of elements to include powerful aspects of reality, though, you've got a host of character inspirations right there. Sailor Moon and the Sailor Scouts, for instance, with their planet-based symbolism, or Ghost Rider, the Spirit of Vengeance, and yes, again, I know that the character is much more complicated than that. I just like the second one, with Danny Ketch as the mortal host and Johnny Blaze in a mentor role, best. Or, say, Wonder Woman as an embodiment of the spirit of truth and loving submission. Or Captain America, or Mickey Mouse, as embodiments of the underdog made good and the American dream, all wrapped into one. Or Guile and Ryu, the Street Fighter characters, if you want to dispense with the whole underdog bit, and just focus on the embodiment of a nation totemic elements. Guile as the big American hero, and Ryu as filling the same role for the land of the rising sun. Of course, you don't have to choose an element to serve as your source of inspiration. You can easily choose a person, either from fiction or real life. For instance, anybody with any sense can tell that, at least at the outset, Elminster was modeled heavily after Gandalf, except given a healthy sex drive and access to a full suite of D&D's destructive spells. Similarly, the character Guts from the Berserk franchise was based on the real-life mercenary Guts von Berlichingen. Oh, German, you so crazy. I provided a link to the Wikipedia page all about that guy down below, and if you don't kind of want to base a character on him after reading through his biography, I don't know what to tell you. Just extrapolating from that, you could easily draw on any number of real-life people for your favorite fictional characters for further inspirations. Sure, there's plenty of Drizzt Do'Urden clones out there, but seriously, what about a character based on Teddy Roosevelt, or Catherine the Great, or Vlad the Impaler? Now that's some role-playing action I'd love to see, especially in the same party. Oh, and by the way, for those game masters out there watching, and as a slight diversion from our topic at hand, if you haven't already started to think of ways that the archetypes I've mentioned so far, and will soon mention, can't be used as a way to create all sorts of bad guys for your player characters to face, then I'll point it out explicitly here. Everything in this video can be used to help you start to think of antagonists to act as foils to your protagonists. Honestly, I think some of the very best, most hard-hitting villains are the kinds that are dark mirrors of the heroes, showing what they could be if they ever slip over to the dark side. Lots of heroes have their literal dark side, even Superman in the third Christopher Reeve film, where he had a very literal showdown with his own worst self, with all the same powers, but the reverse of Superman's moral compass. These traits can be mirrored in terms of compare and contrast elements as well. Lex Luthor, for instance, as a foil for Superman, brain versus brawn, normal human versus superpowered alien, pride versus humility, corporate criminal mindset versus small-town American values, morally broken versus moral certainty, and so forth. On the questionnaire, there are questions asking your players what sort of stuff they'd like to have. This can take the form of living stuff, like animal companions. Huey from the game Haunting Grounds, Epona from the Legend of Zelda franchise, Brown from Rule of Rose, or the Lone Ranger's horse, Silver, are all examples of character development by acquiring an animal companion, and through the development of the relationship between character and companion. That relationship is often the big point of a character's development. In fact, since the animal companion, or whatever it might be, is a character in its own right. And then there's the more typical sort of swag, cool stuff. Seriously, a lot of character development is getting stuff. This is a traditional thing, by the way. I mean, if you think of the Monkey King from Journey to the West, or his more recent copycat, Goku, from the Dragon Ball franchise, you're likely to think of his stuff, his staff, his flying cloud, and the headband that forced him to do the right thing, or it would squeeze until his head popped. Okay, maybe Goku didn't get to play around with most of those, but all the same, it's a thing. King Arthur was pretty much defined by the swords he carried, whether it be the sword and the stone, or Excalibur, or whether those swords were the same or different from each other. Nobody seems to know, and I'm not going to even try and weigh in on the subject. The whole book, The Legend of Tarek, by Walter Dean Myers, entirely revolves around quest for the cool stuff, including an animal companion that will allow its titular character to drive the evil invaders from his land, and the character growth he has to develop in order to acquire each of those precious items. Harry Potter's wand, the twin to that of his arch-nemesis, has character development and backstory built right in. And of course, the Master Sword from the Legend of Zelda series is the archetypal example of this sort of item. The idea of loot being a sort of character development can also be merged with the idea of physical character changes. While I shared some examples of this already, getting swag that turns a character drawback into an advantage is a major part of true heroism, and a sign of true growth, like, say, the artificial right eye used by Garrett in the Thief game series, after he lost his original to treachery and dark magic in the first game, or Captain Hook's eponymous feature in the Peter Pan stories. Getting these kinds of changes, losing something, but replacing it with something as good or better, at least for your specialized purposes, shows that the character adapts, grows, and won't ever give up. In a hero, that's awe-inspiring. In a villain, it's terrifying. Overall, I think that the rest of the player character questionnaire is fairly self-explanatory, so I'll leave off discussing its nuances here. And if I'm wrong, and there's still ambiguity within its depths, well, I leave their deciphering to your imagination. Making house rules is part of a game master's job, after all. There is one last thing I'd like to bring up, though, before I conclude this video, and that's the idea of character-centered sessions. In most shows, very often, an entire episode is dedicated to a single character, even sometimes an especially minor character who otherwise does little except act as a window dressing for the rest of the series. So why not copy that idea and let the players each have an episode like this? In television, this is a fantastic way to ensure that everybody gets some proper development, and there's absolutely no reason why this can't work for your players with just as much effectiveness. If you do decide to run with this idea, though, please make sure that such sessions are fairly and evenly distributed. Give everybody an equal number of adventures that focus just on them, and do your best to keep the other players from stealing the spotlight during these sorts of adventures. They'll get their own turns in due course. Probably the best way to pull this sort of adventure off without working yourself to death over it is to let the player getting that focus to set the tone and work with you for what they'd like to see happen. Here's where all that stuff on the player character questionnaire really comes in handy, because it will give both you and the player of the character getting the attention an opportunity to really think through what to do with that character, and whether to focus that adventure on the character's past or on their future. If the focus is on the character's past, that means that something out of their background will have relevance in the adventure. Perhaps a loved one is in peril from the campaign's villains, or being tempted to join the campaign's main villains, or maybe they've already joined as one of the masked and mysterious threats that have been plaguing the party from the start of the campaign. Perhaps the character's hometown is being besieged by some threat, Seven Samurai style. There could be a nemesis on the character's trail, which the character forgot about in the heat of their adventures. For instance, Han Solo's troubles with Jabba the Hutt certainly fall into this category. Or maybe the character's old flame has come to demand that they fulfill their promise of marriage made long ago, but still legally binding in their culture. The possibilities are simply rife. Usually, though, they result in the character laying to rest some lingering difficulty from the past and becoming more stable as a result, achieving greater inner peace, which allows the character to then press forward with greater purpose and resolve. By contrast, a focus on the character's future means that the character is out for some serious swag. Maybe they're on the lookout for a magic item. Again, Link's Master Sword comes immediately to mind. Alternatively, they could want to make that cool item themselves. Some characters are more hands-on sorts than others, after all. Or they might want an animal companion, familiar, or something similar. Maybe they want to advance in social rank, or acquire a piece of property, like a castle, or found a business, or a mercenary company. They could want a mentor, somebody to teach them the secret arts of their chosen profession, be that magic, martial arts, or matrix jacking. Maybe they want to start a family, with all the complications the adventuring life that brings, a process that can easily mix a focus on the past and the future, if the marriage is to somebody the character knows from before they entered the adventuring life. Overall, though, the idea behind a future-focused adventure is to constantly press forward with the character's life, often with the specific intention of making that character more immediately able to deal with the challenges of being an adventurer, and perhaps even with a little bit of an eye out for what the character might do if they ever get the opportunity for retirement. Typically, past-focused, character-centered adventures require a lot more investment of time and energy, including emotional energy from both the player and the game master. This tends to make them really tough to run, at least in my opinion. However, because of the high drama they usually involve, I've also found them personally to be among the most emotionally satisfying of adventures, when they're done right. In comparison, future-focused adventures for a particular character are usually pretty easy, since they're pretty much like any other adventure except focused primarily on one character in the party. They aren't usually as emotionally charged, but there's still a very real sense of satisfaction when a character finally gets to triumphantly draw the sword from the stone. Hopefully this video has helped you to give you some ideas for how to help your players develop their characters to that next level of gameplay, and also in general game mastery guidance. If you found these videos useful and would like to see more, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. And with all of that said, and all of that done, I wish you all the very best.